Hello, fellow presenters. Look who's back. It's been a while. A lot has happened. I'm in a completely new environment, but I'm back and ready to connect with you all. Okay, so I give this video to you after a bloodbath election last week. And I know that the focus of my channel is primarily championing and helping those that seek to move to the city and pursue their freelancer slash self-employed portfolio careers, if you like. But I wanted to reflect upon the election because actually there's a lot here. And I think some people might think, you know what, I'm not really a political person and this doesn't apply to me. But I would argue there's always something that everybody cares about. And actually so much of what happens and what is kind of decided upon really does affect us, and I really want to speak about that and how this can affect perhaps a young millennial or younger or older even that moves into the city, and how this, or their local city, and how this new landscape could affect them going forward, and just sort of reflect on this very Game of Thrones-esque bloodbath election where we saw so many seats changed. I do like the theatrics of an election night and staying up late. Now, I've always considered myself as not aligning myself with any political party. I suppose I'm quite centrist, but equally I definitely was very anti this government. And it's interesting when you had Sir John Curtis say that this was very much an anti-conservative vote, and you could say that in many respects. But I think for me, do you know what, I will give one concession about the Conservatives, and that was in their last budget, they decided to scrap and reduce national insurance contributions, because I think that, alongside certain elements of stamp duty, is one of the most unfair taxes that we have, particularly because when we speak about politics and your kind of view and outlook, often people say, oh, I'm quite right-wing or I'm quite left-wing. But I think for me, I'm pro my generation and beyond having the same opportunities, if not better, than the older generation. And I think it's such an unfair burden that we have, having to subsidise our pensioners. And don't get me wrong, I know we should respect elders in our society, but equally, we won't have the same benefits that they have or same sense of lifestyle, because the pension schemes aren't as generous. People get a lot less for their money in terms of housing. And I really think that this is a big key reason why we all need to be somewhat engaged with politics. And that's why I was really trying to get as many people as possible to vote, even though that we have a rather restrictive voting system. I totally hear that. But I think it's important to show that actually there are voters there to engage. It's interesting because Keir Starmer won this election on a lower vote share, but actually he had an amazing strategy that really worked for him, that gave him a kind of Tony Blair-esque majority. So there you have it. Whereas interestingly, Jeremy Corbyn got more votes. It says a lot about the kind of the landscape of our politics and the kind of game that they have to play. So yes, I'll give that concession on the Conservatives, that they were trying to abolish national insurance. I think the idea of getting young people to enlist in national service, the sentiment there, I just think was absolutely terrible. I'm not necessarily against it in principle, but I think that it's basically because they can't give young people a better offering. And I just think that, the idea of people doing that unpaid and so forth, I think actually what they needed to do was recognise that they need a supported housing situation, and that actually now we are expecting a lot of parents to have to kind of subsidise their younger children's housing, because they don't have the same opportunity and same access to kind of long-term housing, be it in terms of affordable housing scheme or being able to buy a property that the older generations do. So I think that we all did. So I think that's something to recognise. And I appreciate that doesn't apply to everyone. as well. And I actually think that the commitment to the triple lock on the pension was somewhat irresponsible, because I think we're starting to have a pensions crisis now. A lot of people are just about managing to afford to have a pension or own their own home, from my generation and younger. And I don't think we're really looking at what the ramifications of that is. And I think it's something that they had to do in desperation to try and appeal to some of their voters. But also I think there's that element of how vulnerable does that make certain younger generations to the older generations, perhaps within their family. Okay, now what's fascinating in this election was how the Liberal Democrats, targeting about 90 seats, managed to get over 70 of those. I mean, that is an astonishing win. And in my hometown, where I grew up in Essex, that has always been part of the Tory heartlands, a super safe seats. Seeing that change was just, it's just unprecedented. I think that there were a lot of things in the Liberal Democrats manifesto that I think resonated, trying to fix the NHS, rejoin the single market. I mean, I am pro-EU, being part of the EU. That's something that I'm really passionate about. I think we need to be part of the EU, opportunities for young people and so forth. I think Brexit is an absolute disaster. And I know that they didn't put a referendum on the cards, but the idea that they have that outlook is really important. I'm not a fan of reform. I've had many arguments in my family over reform's outlook on things, and I think when I teach in doctors and I speak to how many of them are moving to Australia, and when I think about just how our public services are collapsing, I think it would be really irresponsible to kind of bring back a sense of trustonomics. And in terms of what we as freelancers, self-employed people need to survive, I don't think anything that they offer really helps us. And just to go back onto the Conservatives' manifesto, there was something in there where they said, we're going to bring back the renters reform bill, look over legislation again to protect renters' rights. But the truth is, they had the whole of the last parliament to do that. And one of the biggest anxieties I had was about, when my rent is up for review, I'll have an extra rent increase and so forth. But I think really there's a conflict of interest with their donors, with what they want, primarily, and I think it's not something that they could be trusted to deliver on. I mean, we had some kind of renters reform bill that Michael Gove put through, but equally it didn't go far enough and they didn't address a lot of the points. So I don't think that they could be believed there. And housing is one of the biggest issues, I would argue the biggest issue for younger people, because your house is your biggest outgoing. And interestingly, when we think about Labour, I did write to my MP about the inclusion of self-employed professionals in or being eligible for certain housing schemes, not just social housing but intermediate housing, because we're self-employed, we do our accounts, and actually sometimes it's very easy to fall through the gaps because actually our profits might not be high enough, but our turnover might be, and we might not have enough years accounts, we might need a guarantor, we might actually be paying more on the private market than before, than if we were to actually access one of these schemes, which kind of makes the case that, we should be given eligibility for that. So that was something, and although I got a response, I was told that I couldn't be given a surgery appointment to look at my recommendations, and in part I was told because of the war in Ukraine and so forth, which I didn't think was a fair response actually, because when I wrote about that was very much local to that area. And what's happening in Ukraine is absolutely devastating. It's an important foreign policy issue, but equally, I don't think that's a good enough reason to be denied an appointment. But there you go. I'm going to be optimistic with Labour though, because I think the way that Keir Starmer has operated. I think there's been a lot of pragmatism. I have to say there are some things that I think were quite brutal in the way that he had to kind of keep the with what happened with Faiza Shaheen and so forth. But equally, she wasn't able to stand, and Ian Duncan Smith was able to get in out in Essex, which I think I'm not a fan of his at all. And the way that he has put this universal credit system, and where a lot of self-employed people fall through the gaps. But I think this is what's fascinating with politics. I thought it was fascinating seeing all of those independent candidates, even though I might not be aligned with certain particular parts of their values, such as with Jeremy Corbyn and so forth, were very to the left. But equally, I think it's great for politics to be able to have independence, particularly in our system. The other thing I liked about the Liberal Democrats, by the way, is that they were pushing for proportional representation, because I think that's one of the things that disenfranchises a lot of people in politics. I mean, growing up, it was always it was a Tory heartland, so it's great that there's that sense that seats aren't always safe. What is a safe seat now? So much is up for grabs, but I would like to see a push for proportional representation in some form, particularly so that we, as the millennials and younger and older that watch this channel and that are self-employed freelancers, can have a voice in that regard as well. It's really important. Something else that happened in the election, which was fascinating, is that the Greens upped their seats from 1 to 4, and 2 of those seats were in the kind of conservative heartlands, about protecting greenery and so forth. So that's interesting. So I think they want to be seen to be increasing housing provision, and I think a lot of that will happen in the cities. I'm open to the idea of a wealth tax. I think it's needed because we are seeing rising inequality, and we're talking about over 10 million here. So I think that is fair. The idea that working people like us pay more than, say, Rishi Sunak does proportionally is a big problem in terms of having public services and looking after the sick and so forth. I do think that the biggest problem with the Greens policy is that they wanted to balance national insurance contributions on higher earners. That's a big problem, because you're talking about balancing that on not just working people, but working people that aren't pensioners. And maybe they were restricted in this regard, but I think what they needed to do, or needed to be questioned on, what I was yearning for them to be questioned on, and I couldn't see this anywhere, is why wouldn't you put that on a pensioner? Because actually 75% of pensioners currently own their home outright and don't have a mortgage. It's becoming a ticking time bomb that when we become pensioners, many of us won't own our own homes, and I see that amongst a lot of our peers. And so I think actually they have a lot more disposable income if you were to introduce this national insurance charge at the very least. Although I think actually it's a squeeze on the middle class at the moment, and I think that was actually a big downfall in their policy. But maybe it's the case that it's not something that they could strategically implement to appeal to their voter base and win perhaps those 2 more conservative seats. Interestingly, I was at my union's conference with Equity, and they had Thangam Debonair speak, and she was one of the people that lost her seat to the Greens. So it's just, as I say, it's a fascinating bloodbath, just checking that this is still running. Nigel Farage, he did get his seat in my home county, further out in Essex. But when I speak about proportional representation, fair is fair, and that means that his Reform Party should also have some representation in Parliament. I like the fact that, I hope that on platforms though, because actually when you think about things like Question Time and other shows and other news programmes, a lot of Reform the reform kind of voice, if you like, is on a lot of these shows, and I'm quite a political junkie. I listen to a lot of podcasts and so forth. I hope that Liberal Democrats will get that as well, because they've got 70 seats now. And I think actually when we think about what people's voting intention is, and I appreciate this argument can be used in many ways and could also be used to contradict some of what I could be seen to be saying here. But equally, we don't know how everybody would have wanted to vote without all of this tactical voting. Some Lib Dems voted Labour, some Labour inclined people voted Lib Dems, and so forth. And also, some people voted knowing who was going to win their seat. I live in a seat where it was very, very, very unlikely that this person was going to lose their seat. Make of that what you will. Maybe you can read into who that is. But actually, a lot of people voted in a way that they wanted to send a signal that actually they are an engaged voter and that their vote is not a foregone conclusion, having known what the outcome would have been. So a lot of people, or actually happy that this would have been the outcome, that they would have won that seat anyway. So a lot of people voted like that. And when I vote, I do often think about not just the message that I want to send, but the direction that I want government to go in as well. I actually like a highly contested government. I actually don't like a government having too many seats. I know some people think, oh, well, it's very bureaucratic, you don't get much done, but actually you get a lot of good detail. I think a good example of that might be, I remember years back watching unfold the disaster the Conservatives tried to implement when people were being moved over to universal credit, and there was a cash flow problem where people wouldn't be able to get their payment for weeks, and it would put a lot of families in difficulty and arrears. But actually when it went to the House of Lords and you had a lot of Labour and Liberal Democrat people speak on it, you actually had that being contested, and you had a detail put in there that actually they would receive their eligible payment within a certain time, because otherwise that would just be really unjust. So I think you need that healthy amount of votes being contested. But back to being a freelancer, I'm very concerned about, I want us to have a balance of being able to speak to those with an aspirational entrepreneurial quality, but equally not penalising us so heavily, but that makes certain industries not accessible for work. Particularly if you're of a certain generation, it might be dictated by your housing situation. And I'm very passionate about inner city housing being accessible for self-employed people of precarious industries, because actually I think once you have a suitable long-term stable housing situation, that means you can thrive. And I think you have to look at that on balance. And I think actually we're living in a society of such extremes where if you get a council house, you're living in some ways a lot better than somebody on the brutal private rental market that gets a lot less for their money and has a lot less disposable income because they're paying that higher rent, even though they might be earning more than somebody in a lesser paid job but in a social housing situation. I mean, where I've done videos before, I've been in that tiny studio paying about £1,000 a month for one room. Great location, but equally if it was a social flat it would be less. And I think that kind of jackpot scenario is quite problematic, of depending on who gets access to certain housing. I appreciate this is seen as a bit of a ramble, but I did just want to kind of talk and show I'm back and just give my thoughts and everything, particularly because I feel so energized on the election and following that, and equally I've got a lot of interesting content ideas coming up for you as well, which will speak to the different strands of what I do, and I hope that we can build this community going forward of freelancers that pursue their passions in their local city. Okay, what else was there to say? So I suppose we will watch this space with the reform vote and what happens with the Conservative Party. Do they have to pander now to the right, or do they initially have to be seen to pander to the right, but then actually go back to the centre? There were some great speeches as well. I think Penny Mordaunt's exit speech was a fantastic speech, about not moving to the right and keeping those values, and I thought it was a very honourable speech. Jeremy Hunt gave a good speech, actually. I'm not a fan of how he's privatised a lot of the NHS, and I've spoken to a lot of doctors that weren't a fan of his from how he was as health secretary. But equally, that's another thing that I thought was another speech that I thought was really well done, actually, that we're lucky to live in a democracy where we can choose. We're not in a dictatorship, and that's very important. I have to say I loved Liz Truss's downfall. Not only, I think there was a sense of entitlement that she would get to keep her seat, and I just really commend the work that people have done in her constituency to say no, she will not have that seat. What she has done to a lot of people is absolutely terrible. It's completely irresponsible, and she seems to show no remorse for it. And I think the fact that she didn't even have the grace or dignity to give an exit speech as a prime minister, she just sort of walked off, really speaks to her character, actually, and I think good riddance. Well, there's a lot that we've covered there. I have to say, I'm quite happy that the SNP have been had a big downfall as well, because whilst I think a lot of the way that they were managed by Nicola Sturgeon, there were some good parts, particularly with the pandemic. I agree with the union. Hope the union will be together, and so I'm glad to see that. And I think it put us in a difficult situation, because those in the south, because actually we didn't have a united voice, and it kind of lent itself to having this shambles of a government. I'm hoping that actually we'll have more stability, because we need that. I think when you have people like Suella Braverman who kind of resign and then come back in, there's a lot of this kind of, I should get the appointment because I've been loyal to you, so I'm owed this Home Secretary position, because there's a lot of this sort of scheming behind the scenes, House of Cards-esque, if you like. And I think we have to clamp down on that, because it's not always great for the state of our nation. And I hope that we're going to see a landscape now where things will thrive. And I will speak out on things that I think, this isn't working. Thinking about acting, for example, and arts workers, we've got a clause which allows us to be charged for when we seek work, and that's why we have this vile company called Spotlight that can charge all actors on a database. And I want to see that absolutely removed, because I think it's an unfair charge and monopoly. And I really will look closely to what they offer with housing, and how they make housing accessible for the younger generations. And something that I really want to see, actually, is revision of the Help to Buy scheme, and for self-employed people to be allowed to contribute into a pension, but be able to access that before 55 or 57. I think 57, is the age now, if they're able to buy a home, because that's what I think young people need. So look, let's watch this space, and I appreciate maybe some people might be watching this, they might not be native to the UK, but they might be thinking of moving to London. It's still really important, because you still can liaise with your local councillors on local policy issues that affect you, and in some ways that might be hindering you being able to really flourish in your freelancer career and discipline, and housing is one of them. Okay. Where are we at now? Okay, so that's 25 minutes. Oh my goodness. If you've made it to the end of this video, put a comment at the bottom that says he's back. See you in the next video, guys. Adios. One thing that I forgot to add is in particular be looking at what this government will be doing to tackle crime. Our prisons are full. I think it's interesting that they've hired the Timpson boss, but one of the big problems that we've got in inner cities, and that I warn you all when you move to London, is this phone snatching culture. And the police can't really take it seriously because I think, in fairness to them, they've not been given the resources to do so and to really clamp down upon it. So I'm really hoping it's going to be something that they really look at their system and how they deal with it. So that's something I'm going to be keeping a lookout for. So I want us to feel safer on our streets. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times that I'll go into Pret, I'll see people just walk in, take whatever they want, and off they go. And the staff, in fairness to them, can't do anything. And why should they? It's beyond their pay grade. And these people won't be held accountable. So it's a real problem in our cities. I think there's a lot of talk about violent knife crime and so forth, but actually that doesn't affect the majority of Londoners. A lot of that sort of drug-induced gang cultures, if you like, but what does affect a lot of Londoners is this sort of petty crime, what's considered petty crime. It's this phone snatching. So I hope that this government will take that seriously.